A very special welcome back to the second half of this month's guest hour.
Thank you.
And we'd like to summarize a little bit last week's discussion before we begin this week's interview. We learned last week that Mr. Nishiyama was schooled in the United States, and that after his formal education, he came to Japan and began to live and work here, and he totally mastered the Japanese language, and I must say I'm very, very envious that he's bilingual.
Well, I wish I were too. And Mr. Nishiyama, today I'd like to start off by asking what, in your opinion, is the primary responsibility of an interpreter?
The primary responsibility of an interpreter is to transmit in a different language, that is the language of another country, the information that is expressed by the speaker.
So you're not supposed to put in any personal feelings
No, sir.
whatsoever?
No, and the idea is to receive what the speaker has said in its total information, in all of its detail, and also then express that in the other language in an equal amount of detail with as closely an accurate rendition of that information as possible. But that does not mean word for word interpreting.
That makes the whole thing even more difficult. And then if the speaker gets excited, then the interpreter should excited as well?
The interpreter perhaps emotionally should not get excited, but nevertheless should be able to express in a voice that indicates this excitement.
Well, I suppose among your many experiences in interpreting, that the Apollo experience was certainly one of the most unforgettable times.
Oh, yes.
Could you tell us something about that event?
Oh, that was a tremendous event. As a matter of fact, the Apollo flights began, at least as far as the broadcasting on television was concerned in Japan. It began in the autumn of 1968 with Apollo 7, and it went right on through to Apollo 17 in 1972. The most famous one, of course, was Apollo 11, which landed on the moon. And I must say that was a most exciting week or 10 days here in the studio of NHK.
And I'm sure you must have used a lot of, say, special terms.
Oh, yes.
Which I'm afraid were difficult for, say, the layman.
Not only just the layman, for everyone, because the terms, even in the English language, were new terms. Because there was never such a piece of equipment such as the Apollo spacecraft, you see, before. So there were many new terms in the English language. So naturally, we had to work out similar terms in the Japanese language. And so I discussed this with the staff of the NHK station, and also with the science commentator, Mr. Kenya Murano, who covered all of those programs. And we had to work out in Japanese terms.
So you must have coined some new words.
Well, a number of terms were coined at that time in Japanese, yes.
And
excuse me, but they had to be terms that would be immediately understandable in the Japanese language when the average television viewer heard the term.
Oh.
For example, in English, we had the term lunar module. Now, the lunar module is that portion of the spacecraft that actually landed on the moon and then took off from the moon back to Earth. Japanese, if I may be allowed to use some Japanese here, we called it the Tsuki Chakuriku Sen. So that just by that Japanese term, everybody would understand what it meant. Yes.
That's interesting. Well, to change the subject slightly, Mr. Nishiyama, there's a great deal of talk about cross-cultural communication these days, and they say the mere knowledge of English is not sufficient to achieve successful communication with Americans or any other English-speaking people. And could you elaborate on this point a little bit?
Yes, I might illustrate it with one or two examples. One is, of course, that even if one feels that he or she knows the English language and the equivalents that are in English from Japanese, if we take a word such as "rikai shimashita" or "wakarimashita," and if we translate that as "I understand," or that I am able to understand this. In English, the word "understand" usually means that the person has heard the information and recognizes the information, and not necessarily agree with the information. Whereas in Japanese, oftentimes if we say that the person has been able to rikai this thing, in other words, yoku rikai shimashita, as an example, that would imply that at the same time that one understood the information, one also tacitly agrees with the information. So there is a difference there. Or take the word sumimasen.
Yes.
We use the word sumimasen in Japanese for many occasions. Sometimes it is an apology. At other times it is an expression of appreciation for something that has been done for you. But if we translate that literally as "I'm sorry" or "excuse me," it carries a completely different meaning in English, because "I'm sorry" is actually an apology and only an apology.
So I'm sure that in this process of trying to translate, sometimes misunderstandings arise because of some kind of cultural rooted background. In these terms, I suppose there's some young listeners who are interested in becoming simultaneous interpreters. So do you have advice for our young listeners of how to become proficient and how to handle these problems as you seem to do so well?
Well, if you'll allow me a little bit of time to explain, I shall try to in the few minutes that we have. Number one, especially if the person is a Japanese wishing to become a simultaneous interpreter or an interpreter per se. Number one, I think the person must be able to speak correct Japanese.
Oh, Japanese, no English.
English as well, but especially since he is a Japanese or she is a Japanese, that person must start with that person's native language, which is Japanese, and be able to speak it correctly and fluently and in complete sentences. Not half sentences, which are so easy to say in Japanese. Sentences without the subject, for example, can be complete sentences in Japanese. But one must be able to express oneself very clearly and accurately in Japanese. At the same time, of course, the person must become bilingual in the sense of being able to speak English or some other foreign language equally as fluently as one's own native language. Then, of course, one must have a broad background of knowledge. Those are what might be called the prerequisites, the basic requirements for becoming an interpreter. Then, the interpreter in training must be able to express what someone else has said accurately and not express what he or she is thinking. In other words, we usually speak only our own thoughts. When we listen to someone else, we hear that person and get a general idea of what that person is saying. But the whole attitude of the mind is reversed. One is then totally attentive to what is being said by the speaker in all of its detail, all of the details of the expression and the information. And then one must be able to express that so that one must not edit, one must not comment on it, but one must express it accurately. Again, I say not word for word, because that is not the way to do it, but to express it in the most natural form in the other language.
I'd like to ask you sort of a backwards question. If you were to walk into a group of students, a classroom, and you were to immediately omit some students as unqualified to become simultaneous interpreters, what type of behavior or language pattern would you immediately say, no chance?
Well, if it were just language patterns, I would ask the student to come up to the platform and give a 5-minute talk on his or her favorite hobby and see how fluent, lucid, or clear and well that person can express those ideas.
Mm-hmm. It may sound easy, but actually it must be very difficult to do, huh?
Well, usually young people, and I used to be this way myself when I was young. Usually young people only express their own native language in terms of conversations with other friends. And so they speak in little bits and pieces and wait for the other side to respond or to urge the person to go on. And then we speak a little bit more. And that is the way that conversation is usually carried out in normal social occasions. And that is usually the level of language that we are familiar with. But that will not suffice. That will not do in interpreting.
And could I just ask one more thing about the technical aspect of interpreting and the term simultaneous interpretation seems to me in such a common use, but how does it differ from, say, another type of interpreting?
Yes, well, simultaneous interpreting is, of course, what the term implies, which is that when the speaker starts speaking, the interpreter, just a few moments later, will start interpreting. And as the interpreter is interpreting, the interpreter is listening also to the information that is coming into the ear, you see, and so the interpreter continues on this way. In consecutive interpreting, the speaker speaks a bit and then allows the interpreter to interpret. Then the speaker speaks again, and the interpreter interprets.
And which is more difficult, I wonder?
It depends on how long the speaker speaks. If the speaker is giving a lecture, for example, and speaks, let us say, the equivalent of a whole relatively long paragraph, and then allows the interpreter to interpret, that form of consecutive interpreting is more difficult than simultaneous interpreting. And the reason for this is that the listener expects consecutive interpreting to be almost perfect in sentence formation and also very fluent with no hesitation whatsoever. Whereas in simultaneous interpreting, of course, the sentence formation may be a bit odd, but the listener gives
some allowance,
for this, as long as the information is understood.
I'd like to ask you if you have any hints for our listeners who are all trying to learn the English language of how to express themselves effectively in English.
Well, I would say that that is the same as learning how to express oneself clearly in one's own native language, myself, but it takes a lot of good, hard work and study of all kinds, reading, writing, and speaking.
And constant practice?
And constant practice, yes. After all, if you are learning a sport, you constantly practice to get your form just exactly right. And the same thing should be true with language, which in a sense is a physical exercise as well as a mental exercise, just like sports is.
Well, Mr. Nishiyama, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's all the time we have today. And thank you very much indeed for being with us. And I'm sure our listeners found your talk so helpful and interesting.
Well, thank you very much, and it's been a real privilege and pleasure.
Everybody, this concludes today's guest hour. So long.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
担当は東後勝明先生。お相手はベス・ヒギンズさんでした。英語会話を終わります。